They said a home worth $50 could not save a man, but in America, where old roads remember every prayer whispered behind a steering wheel, sometimes the smallest door is the one heaven has been holding open the longest. The morning Caleb Whitaker inherited the cabin, the town of Pine Hollow was wrapped in a pale Montana cold that made every window look like frosted glass and every breath rise like a secret leaving the body. The county office stood at the corner of Main and Alder, a two-story brick building with a flag snapping softly above the steps and a brass plaque near the door polished by decades of tired hands. Caleb stood at the back of the probate room in a faded army field jacket, his shoulders broad but slightly bowed, not from weakness, but from the quiet weight carried by men who had learned to stand through weather without asking it to be kinder. He was 40 years old, white, square-jawed, with dark brown hair touched by silver near the temples and a week of stubble shadowing his face. His boots were clean enough for respect but worn enough to tell the truth. Beside him sat Ranger, his 6-year-old German shepherd, tall and disciplined, silver-gray and tan coat brushed by the weak winter light coming through the blinds, amber eyes fixed not on the people, but on the old iron key lying on the lawyer's desk. Caleb had slept the night before in his Ford pickup behind Miller's Feed and Grain, the same truck that had become bedroom, closet, kitchen, and shelter since the work ran out and the motel money disappeared. A rolled sleeping bag rested behind the seat. A dented thermos sat in the cup holder. Ranger's black harness hung from the rearview mirror like a small flag from a country only the two of them still belonged to. Around town, people knew pieces of Caleb, though few knew the whole man. They knew he had served overseas as a combat engineer. They knew he could fix a fence, patch a roof, wire a breaker box, or mend a broken water line without saying much. They knew he paid for coffee with exact change, always held the door for older women, and never let Ranger eat until he had poured the dog fresh water first. Some called him quiet. Some called him unlucky. A few, when they thought he could not hear, called him one of those homeless veteran stories people shook their heads about before turning back to their pancakes. Caleb never corrected them. He had learned long ago that dignity did not always need witnesses. The lawyer, Mr. Harlan Price, adjusted his glasses and unfolded the will with the careful hands of a man who had spent his life reading other people's endings. The room smelled of dust, lemon polish, wet wool coats, and old paper. A wall clock ticked above a framed photograph of the county courthouse from 1948. Outside, tires whispered through slush on Main Street. Inside, every sound seemed too sharp. "Mr. Whitaker," the lawyer said, his voice low but formal, "Mrs. Eleanor Briggs left you the property known as Cedar Hollow Cabin, located 6 miles north of Pine Hollow Ridge." A few chairs shifted. Someone near the front gave a small, disbelieving laugh. Caleb looked down at Ranger, whose ears had risen half an inch. "The assessed structure value," Mr. Price continued, pausing as if the number embarrassed even him, "is $50. This time the laugh spread thinly across the room, not loud enough to be cruel in court, but sharp enough to leave a mark. A man in a brown ranch coat leaned toward his wife and muttered, "$50? That place isn't a cabin. It's firewood with a roof." Someone else whispered that the roof sagged, that the well had gone bad years ago, that no one had lived there since old Thomas Briggs passed. They spoke of the cabin the way people speak of things already dead, as if naming its worth had finished it. Caleb did not move. His face remained still, trained by years of hearing worse news in harder rooms. But his right hand, resting at his side, opened once and closed again. Ranger saw it. The dog pressed his shoulder gently against Caleb's leg, a steady pressure, quiet as a hand on the back of a church pew. Mr. Price cleared his throat and slid a yellowed envelope across the desk. "Mrs. Briggs also asked that you receive this key and a personal note. She was very specific that no one else was to open it." Caleb stepped forward. The floorboards gave a faint creak beneath his boots. Up close, the key looked older than the desk itself, black and iron with a round bowl worn smooth by a thumb that must have turned it thousands of times. Tied to it with faded blue thread was a small paper tag. On it, in careful handwriting, were 4 words, "For the man who stopped." Caleb's throat tightened before he understood why. 3 weeks earlier, he had found Eleanor Briggs stranded in the rain beside the cemetery road, her Buick sunk nearly to the axle in brown mud, her white hair tucked under a plastic scarf, her hands trembling as she tried to wave down passing cars that did not slow. Caleb had stopped because that was what you did when someone was alone in the rain. He had pulled her car free, cleaned her battery terminals, and let Ranger sit beside her with his warm head resting against her knee while the engine caught again. She had offered money. He had refused. She had studied him with those clear blue eyes and asked why a man with so little would give so easily. Caleb had only shrugged and said, "Ma'am, I know what it feels like when nobody stops." Now, standing beneath the humming fluorescent lights of the county office, he felt the weight of that moment return, not as memory, but as a door beginning to open somewhere far away. Ranger rose to all fours. His nose lifted toward the key. A low breath moved through him, not a growl, not fear, but recognition, the kind of stillness old soldiers trusted because it came before understanding. The lawyer opened the envelope and read Eleanor's final line aloud, softer than the rest: "Some homes are not worth what men say. They are worth what they remember." The laughter in the room died without anyone asking it to. Caleb took the key. It was cold in his palm, colder than metal should have been, as if it had been waiting a long time in a place untouched by morning. Outside the window, the flag lifted once in the wind, and a pale blade of sunlight crossed the desk, touching the key, Ranger's eyes, and Caleb's weathered hand at the same time. For the first time in many months, Caleb Whitaker had an address, though everyone in Pine Hollow believed it was worthless. Ranger knew better. The dog kept staring at the key as if somewhere deep in the cedar woods, beyond 6 miles of snow and silence, the old $50 log cabin had just begun calling them home. Caleb left the county office with the key closed inside his fist and Ranger walking close enough that their shadows touched on the sidewalk. Pine Hollow moved around them in its ordinary morning rhythm, quiet but watchful, the way small towns often do when something has happened and no one wants to be the first to admit it mattered. A delivery truck hissed at the curb outside the bakery. Steam rose from a diner vent and carried the smell of bacon, coffee, and hot griddle cakes into the cold air. Across the street, a hardware store owner paused while stacking bags of salt, his eyes following Caleb with the careful curiosity people reserve for a man they have already judged and are now being asked by life to reconsider. Caleb kept his head low. He had survived enough rooms full of opinions to know that silence could be a stronger coat than wool. The old iron key felt heavy in his palm, much heavier than anything worth $50 had a right to feel. Ranger stepped ahead near the crosswalk, then stopped and looked back, amber eyes steady beneath the black edge of his harness. The dog had always done that. In crowded places, on lonely roads, outside buildings Caleb did not want to enter, Ranger checked on him without making a sound, as if loyalty had its own language and did not need grammar. Caleb opened the passenger door of the old Ford pickup, and Ranger jumped in with the practiced grace of a soldier returning to his post. The truck smelled of pine air freshener, engine oil, dog fur, and the faint bitterness of yesterday's gas station coffee. Caleb sat behind the wheel but did not start the engine right away. He unfolded Eleanor Briggs's note again. The paper was thin and soft at the corners, the handwriting delicate but certain. For the man who stopped. Some homes are not worth what men say. They are worth what they remember. He read it 3 times, not because he did not understand the words, but because something in them seemed to understand him. For nearly 2 years, Caleb's life had been measured in temporary things. Temporary jobs. Temporary parking lots. Temporary kindness from strangers who smiled as long as his needs stayed convenient. He had slept under bridges when the weather turned mean, behind churches when the sheriff was merciful, and in the cab of that Ford when the world had no room left for a man who once knew how to build roads through impossible places. American veteran stories often made people feel something for a minute, especially on holidays, especially when flags were fresh and speeches were warm. But Caleb knew the quieter truth. The hardest part of coming home was discovering that home could become a word everyone used and no one offered. Ranger shifted in the passenger seat and placed one paw gently on the folded note. Caleb almost smiled. "You think she knew something, boy?" he asked. Ranger's ears flicked toward the north, toward the long road leading out of town and up into Pine Hollow Ridge. The motion was small, but Caleb had learned to trust small things. A twitch of the ear. A change in breath. The way Ranger's body went still before snow slid from a roof, before a tire went flat, before a stranger approached with trouble in his voice. The German Shepherd had been trained years earlier to find what people missed: buried wires, faint vibrations, hidden hollows beneath packed earth. But Caleb had come to believe Ranger found other things too, things no instructor could teach, like sorrow under a polite smile or hope buried under shame. He turned the key in the ignition. The Ford coughed, trembled, then came alive. They drove west along Main Street, past the post office with its chipped blue drop box, past the white steeple of Grace Methodist, past the laundromat where Caleb had once warmed his hands over a dryer vent while Ranger slept against his boots. The town thinned slowly behind them. Storefronts gave way to ranch fencing, then to open fields pale with frost. A red barn stood half a mile off the road, its roof dusted white, a weather vane turning lazily above it. Cattle moved like dark thoughts near a frozen pond. Farther on, the mountains lifted, blue and patient, holding the horizon the way old men hold stories they are not ready to tell. Caleb drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near Ranger's shoulder. The road north was narrower than he remembered, patched in places, cracked in others, bordered by mailboxes leaning under snowcaps. Every few miles, a hand-painted sign appeared for firewood, eggs, horseshoeing, or church suppers on Friday nights. It was the kind of America that did not hurry, the kind built from porches, gravel drives, wood smoke, and people who knew the weather before they knew the news. Yet beneath its quiet beauty, Caleb felt the familiar ache of not belonging. He had crossed deserts, rivers, and cities, but 6 miles of Montana backroad toward a cabin no one wanted felt strangely harder. Perhaps because this time he was not moving away from something. He might have been moving toward it. The sky lowered as they climbed. Snow began to fall in loose, weightless flakes, touching the windshield and vanishing under the wipers. Ranger sat upright, his nose angled toward the cracked window, breathing in cedar, cold soil, distant water, and whatever else waited beyond human knowing. Caleb passed a rusted sign that read Pine Hollow Ridge Road, then turned onto a gravel lane almost hidden between two lines of dark pines. Branches leaned overhead, knitting the light into thin silver strips. The truck tires crunched over frozen ruts. Somewhere deep in the woods, a crow called once and went silent. Caleb felt the key in his coat pocket press against his ribs with every bump in the road. Almost there, he murmured, though he did not know whether he was speaking to Ranger, to himself, or to the woman who had left a forgotten cabin to a man the world had nearly forgotten. The lane curved around a stand of cedar trees, and then the cabin appeared. It sat in a small clearing beneath the gray afternoon sky, low and weathered, its log walls darkened by years of rain and snow, its stone chimney standing straight despite the sag of the roof. The porch dipped at one corner. One shutter hung loose. A horseshoe, red with rust, had been nailed above the door. To anyone else, it might have looked abandoned. To Caleb, it looked tired but waiting. He cut the engine, and silence poured in at once, deep and clean, broken only by the soft tick of cooling metal and the whisper of snow against glass. Ranger did not leap out right away. He stared through the windshield at the cabin, ears high, body perfectly still. Then, very slowly, he lowered his nose toward the air vent and released a quiet breath that fogged the window. Caleb opened his door and stepped into the snow. The cold reached through his jeans immediately, sharp but honest. Ranger jumped down beside him, walked to the first porch step, and stopped. His paws did not touch the wood. His head tilted. His ears turned forward. Caleb watched the dog listen to a silence that seemed empty to human ears. "What is it?" he whispered. Ranger gave no bark. No growl. Only a soft, uncertain whine, almost too gentle to hear. Caleb looked at the cabin again, at the dark windows, the old door, the iron lock waiting beneath the rusted horseshoe. For the first time since the lawyer had read Eleanor's will, he felt something move inside him that was not fear and not grief, but a fragile kind of recognition. The cabin no one wanted had not welcomed them loudly. It had done something stranger. It had held its breath. Caleb stood before the cabin door with the old iron key in his hand, listening to the kind of quiet that did not feel empty, only patient. Snow settled on the shoulders of his faded army jacket and gathered along Ranger's back in small white flecks, but the German shepherd did not shake them off. He remained at the edge of the porch step, head lowered, amber eyes fixed on the narrow gap beneath the door. Caleb had seen that look before in search work, the look Ranger wore when the world had given him a clue too faint for human senses. It was not fear. It was attention sharpened into something almost holy. "All right," Caleb said softly, more to steady himself than the dog. The porch boards groaned under his boots as he climbed the steps. One board near the rail dipped slightly, and he marked it in his mind the way he marked hazards without thinking. Loose board, left side. Weak hinge. Rusted nail near the threshold. Old habits had followed him home from the service and stayed longer than many people had. He slid the key into the lock. For a second, it resisted. Then something inside turned with a low metal sigh, and the door opened inward on air that smelled of cedar dust, cold stone, old ashes, and paper kept too long in darkness. Caleb stepped inside first, one hand resting against the doorframe. Ranger followed only after a pause, moving slowly, nose close to the floor, tail low but steady. The cabin was smaller than it had looked from the clearing, one main room with a stone fireplace at the far wall, a narrow kitchen to the left, a sleeping loft above a ladder built from hand-smoothed pine, and two windows clouded with frost and years of neglect. Dust lay over everything like a second winter. A cracked enamel coffee pot sat on the stove. A rocking chair faced the fireplace. Beside it was a small table with a lamp, a Bible with a worn leather cover, and a pair of reading glasses folded neatly as if someone had stepped away for only a moment and meant to return before supper. That was what struck Caleb most. Not the damage. Not the sagging roof or the cobwebs in the corners or the cold pressing through the walls. It was the order. The carefulness. The feeling that this place had not been abandoned in anger, but preserved in grief. He set his duffel near the door and walked to the fireplace. The stones were river-worn and pale gray, stacked by hands that knew patience. Above the mantel hung a faded photograph in a simple wooden frame. A young Eleanor Briggs stood in front of the cabin, smiling against a summer light that no longer existed. Beside her was a tall man in a work shirt and suspenders, one arm around her shoulders, the other resting on the head of a German shepherd with dark ears and a proud chest. Caleb leaned closer. The man's face was sunlined and kind, but his eyes held a familiar distance, that faraway look some veterans carried even in photographs taken at picnics, weddings, and county fairs. Under the frame, someone had carved two names into the wood with a pocketknife: Thomas, Eleanor, and Mercy. Ranger rose on his hind legs just enough to look at the photograph. His nose twitched once, and a sound moved through him, soft and questioning. "Looks like you were not the first shepherd here," Caleb murmured. Outside, wind pressed gently against the cabin, and the loose shutter tapped once against the wall. The sound echoed through the room, thin and hollow. Caleb turned. Ranger had already moved away from the fireplace toward the kitchen, where a braided rug lay stiff with dust before a row of lower cabinets. The dog sniffed along the floorboards, stopped near the stove, then circled back, ears changing direction in small, precise movements. Caleb watched him work. There was no hurry in it, no excitement. Ranger seemed to be reading the room through scent and silence. Caleb opened a window to clear the stale air, but it stuck after 2 inches, letting in only a ribbon of cold and the smell of pine. He found a broom in the corner and swept a path across the floor. Dust rose in the weak afternoon light, turning gold for a moment before disappearing. As he worked, his mind returned to Eleanor on the cemetery road, to the way she had looked at Ranger as if recognizing an old friend from another life. He remembered her hand resting on the dog's head, her fingers thin as twigs but gentle. Thomas trusted dogs more than people, she had said through the rain. Dogs know what a heart is doing before a mouth can lie about it. At the time, Caleb had smiled politely, thinking it was the kind of thing older women said when loneliness had made memory tender. Now, inside the cabin Thomas had built, with Ranger following invisible lines across the floor, the words no longer felt like a saying. They felt like instruction. Near sunset, Caleb found a stack of dry kindling in a cedar box by the hearth, wrapped in oilcloth and somehow untouched by damp. He built a small fire, coaxing it slowly until the flames began to breathe. Warmth moved into the room 1 inch at a time. The cabin changed under it. Shadows softened. The glass in the old lamp caught orange light. The rocking chair seemed less lonely. Caleb removed his gloves and held his hands toward the fire, feeling the sting return to his fingers. Ranger lay near the hearth but did not sleep. His eyes stayed open, reflecting flame. For supper, Caleb warmed a can of beef stew over the fire and poured kibble into Ranger's metal bowl. The sound of the dog eating was ordinary, and because it was ordinary, it nearly broke something open in him. A man could go a long time without a kitchen table, without a mailbox, without a porch light left on for him. Then one evening he could sit on the floor of a $50 cabin, eating from a dented pan while snow darkened the windows, and feel the dangerous beginning of hope. He did not trust it yet. Hope had cost him before. But he did not push it away either. After dark, the temperature dropped hard. Caleb laid his sleeping bag near the fireplace and kept his boots within reach. Ranger stretched beside him, his body warm against Caleb's shoulder. The fire settled into embers. The cabin creaked softly as the cold tightened around the logs. Somewhere in the walls, an old house made old house sounds, the small complaints of wood, nail, stone, and weather. Caleb closed his eyes. For the first time in weeks, he was almost asleep when Ranger lifted his head. The movement was so sudden and silent that Caleb woke before he knew why. The German shepherd sat upright, ears high, staring toward the floorboards beneath the fireplace. Caleb held his breath. At first there was nothing. Only wind. Only embers. Then it came, faint enough that another man might have dreamed it. Tap. 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 3 small sounds from below the cabin floor. A pause. Then again. Tap. 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 Ranger did not bark. He raised one paw and placed it carefully on a dark plank near the hearth, then looked back at Caleb with eyes full of a message no human language could hold. Caleb sat up slowly, every nerve awake, but his voice remained gentle. "I hear it too, boy." The cabin seemed to grow still around them, as if the walls themselves were listening. Beneath his palm, when he pressed it to the wood, Caleb felt the slightest vibration, not strong, not threatening, but steady, like a memory knocking from underneath the ears. In that quiet moment, with the fire fading and snow covering the world outside, Caleb understood one thing with absolute certainty. Eleanor Briggs had not given him a shelter. She had given him a question. Caleb kept his palm pressed to the floor until the final vibration faded into the wood, leaving only the low breathing of the fire and the whisper of snow against the windows. Ranger remained beside the dark plank, one paw still resting on it, his body calm but utterly certain. There was no panic in him, no sign of danger, only that grave patience dogs sometimes carry when they have found something meant for their human to understand. Caleb reached for the flashlight in his duffel, clicked it on, and watched the beam move across the floorboards in a pale circle. The plank beneath Ranger's paw was different from the others, not by much, but enough for a man trained to notice small things. Its grain ran slightly against the line of the room. The nail heads were older, darker, worn nearly smooth. Dust had settled along 3 sides but not the 4th, as if the board had shifted sometime in the long life of the cabin and then been carefully returned. Caleb ran his fingers along the seam. Cold air touched his knuckles from underneath. "Well," he whispered, "you did not bring me here for mice." Ranger gave one slow blink, the closest thing to agreement Caleb expected. He found a flathead screwdriver in the kitchen drawer beside a bundle of twine, a box of wooden matches, and an old receipt from a Pine Hollow general store dated 23 years earlier. The drawer itself slid open with a tired rasp, releasing the smell of cedar shavings and thyme. Caleb knelt by the hearth and worked the screwdriver into the seam with careful pressure, not wanting to damage anything more than the years already had. The board resisted at first, then lifted with a soft wooden sigh. Beneath it lay not empty darkness, but a shallow space lined with oilcloth. Ranger lowered his head, sniffed once, and stepped back. Caleb reached inside and felt metal. He drew out a rectangular tin box, dark green, its paint chipped at the edges, its lid tied shut with a strip of faded blue ribbon that matched the thread on Eleanor's key tag. For a long moment he simply held it. The box was cold, but not forgotten. Something about the ribbon made it feel less like a hiding place and more like a promise waiting for permission. He carried it to the small table by the rocking chair and sat down slowly. The chair creaked across from him in the firelight, empty and attentive. Ranger settled at Caleb's feet, ears lifted, nose pointed toward the tin as if it carried a scent older than dust. Caleb untied the ribbon. Inside was a stack of objects arranged with such care that his first instinct was to close the lid again out of respect. There was a black and white photograph of Eleanor Briggs as a young woman, standing beside the same cabin in summer, her dress moving in the wind, her hand resting on the arm of the tall man from the mantel picture. Behind them stood a German shepherd with a dark saddle coat and bright, watchful eyes. Mercy, Caleb remembered from the carving. Beneath the photograph was a military dog tag wrapped in cloth, a brass compass with a cracked glass face, a folded hand-drawn map, 3 letters tied with string, and a small envelope addressed in Eleanor's handwriting, to the soldier who still stops in the rain. Caleb felt the room grow quieter around that sentence. He opened the envelope with the same care he would have used to lift a fragile bird from a windowsill. The paper inside was thin and cream-colored, smelling faintly of lavender and smoke. "My dear Mr. Whitaker," it began, "though by the time you read this, I hope you will forgive an old woman for knowing more than she said. Thomas believed there are 2 kinds of houses. The ones built to keep weather out, and the ones built to keep a promise alive. Cedar Hollow was the second kind." Caleb stopped reading and looked toward the fireplace, toward the photograph of Thomas, Eleanor, and Mercy. The flames moved low across the stones, and for an instant the shadows made the young couple seem less like the past and more like witnesses. He read on. "Thomas came home from his service with hands that could repair almost anything except his own sleep. He built this cabin from cedar logs, river stone, and the stubborn belief that a man should have one place where the world stops asking him to explain his sorrow. For many years, he helped men who had no mailbox, no family nearby, and no bed waiting after the uniform was folded away. He never called it charity. He called it remembering." Caleb swallowed hard. The words found places in him he kept unmarked. American veteran stories, the real ones, rarely began with speeches or ended with medals. More often they lived in unpaid motel receipts, gas station coffee, work gloves drying by a heater, and men sitting alone in trucks pretending they were only resting their eyes. He continued. "If Ranger led you to the floor, then Mercy was right about shepherds. They hear what grief hides. The map will show you where Thomas kept the rest. Do not go tonight unless the weather clears. The hill behind the cabin freezes hard, and roots can fool a bootstep. Wait for morning. Trust the dog. Trust the house. And if you feel unworthy, understand this: worthiness was never the test. Kindness was." Caleb lowered the letter to his lap. For a while he did not move. The cabin made its small sounds around him, logs settling, embers shifting, wind combing through the pines outside. Ranger rested his chin on Caleb's knee, not demanding, not comforting in any dramatic way, simply present. That was the miracle of dogs. They did not ask a man to become better before loving him. They loved him until he remembered he could be. Caleb unfolded the map. It showed the cabin, the creek to the east, the cedar grove behind the ridge, and a marked circle near an old tree labeled Mercy's Watch. A dotted line led from the back door to what looked like a stone outcrop 50 yards uphill. In one corner, written in Thomas's stronger, heavier hand, were 5 words: "The promise room sleeps below." Caleb traced the words with his thumb. The phrase carried no threat, only mystery, but it filled the little cabin with a gravity he could feel in his ribs. Beneath the map lay one final item in the tin, a small brass key no longer than his little finger. It was taped to a card that read, "Not for the front door." Ranger suddenly turned toward the rear wall of the cabin. His ears angled forward. Outside, the wind eased, and in the silence that followed, something beneath the floor gave one last gentle tap, softer than before, almost like an answer. Caleb looked down at the German shepherd, then at the map glowing amber in the firelight. He had arrived believing this cabin might give him a roof. Now, with Eleanor's letter open on the table and Thomas's hidden map in his hand, he understood the roof had only been the beginning. Somewhere beyond the back door, under cedar roots and winter earth, a room built from an old veteran's promise was waiting for morning. Morning arrived slowly, not with sunlight at first, but with the cabin changing its breathing. The night sounds withdrew one by one, the cold loosened its grip on the logs, and the window panes softened from black glass into a pale gray mirror of snow and cedar branches. Caleb woke before the fire had fully died, as he always did, with his hand near his boots and his mind briefly searching for where he was. For one suspended second, he expected the Ford pickup, the stiff ache in his neck, the taste of gas station coffee gone cold. Then he smelled cedar smoke, old paper, and the warm, steady presence of Ranger beside him, and the memory of the hidden tin returned like a lantern being uncovered. The map still lay on the table, weighted at one corner by the cracked brass compass and at the other by Eleanor's letter. In the early light, the words seemed quieter but heavier. The promise room sleeps below. Caleb sat up and rubbed a hand over his face. Ranger was already awake, sitting near the back door, his German shepherd silhouette cut against the faint square of morning. He did not scratch. He did not whine. He simply waited, ears forward, as if he had kept watch over more than the cabin while Caleb slept. "You knew I would not make it until noon," Caleb said, his voice rough from sleep. Ranger glanced back once, then looked at the door again. Caleb built the fire back from embers, warmed water in the old enamel pot, and ate 2 granola bars from his duffel while Ranger finished his breakfast. The ordinary work of morning steadied him. Fold the sleeping bag. Lace the boots. Check the weather. Pack the flashlight, gloves, folding shovel, rope, and the little brass key. It was the kind of preparation he had trusted long before life became uncertain, the simple belief that a man could face the unknown more honestly if his tools were in order. Outside, the world was blue with cold. Snow covered the clearing in a smooth, untouched sheet except for yesterday's tire tracks and Ranger's prints on the porch. The pines stood tall and dark around the cabin, their branches holding white weight with the patience of old church rafters. Somewhere far down the ridge, water moves beneath ice, a hidden creek speaking softly under winter. Caleb locked the front door behind him out of habit, then paused at the irony of guarding a house the town believed worthless. The key turned easier this time, as if the lock remembered his hand. Ranger moved ahead along the back wall, nose low, following a path not visible beneath the snow. Caleb carried Thomas's map folded inside his coat, but after the first 20 yards he stopped looking at it. Ranger did not need ink. The dog moved in slow, certain lines, pausing at a cedar stump, then at a stone half buried under frost, then at a fallen branch shaped like an elbow. Each stop matched the map in its own quiet way. Caleb felt the strange humility of being led, not by a road, not by a sign, but by loyalty with 4 paws and a better understanding of silence. The hill behind the cabin rose gently at first, then steepened near a cluster of old cedar trees. Their trunks twisted upward from the earth like hands that had been clasped in prayer for 100 winters. Caleb's breath came white in front of him. His boots broke through the crusted snow with soft crunching sounds. Ranger reached the largest cedar and stopped. He lifted his head, sniffed the bark, then circled to the far side where roots spread like ribs over a low mound of earth. There, half hidden beneath snow and brown needles, lay a flat stone no wider than a serving tray. Caleb brushed it clean with his glove. Carved into the stone, weathered but still readable, was one word: mercy. The name made the clearing feel less empty. Caleb pictured the shepherd from the photograph standing guard here years ago, dark ears raised, watching the same ridge, hearing the same creak beneath ice. "Mercy's watch," he whispered. Ranger stepped closer and placed his paw on the edge of the stone. It shifted slightly. Caleb knelt, cleared more snow, and found that the stone was not a marker but a cover. Beneath it was an iron ring folded flat into a groove. He worked his fingers under the ring and pulled. The stone resisted, frozen at the edges, but not sealed. With careful pressure and the help of the folding shovel, he loosened the ice until the slab lifted just enough to reveal a narrow gap and the smell of cold earth rising from below. Not decay. Not damp rot. Cedar, stone, and air that had been waiting. Caleb's pulse beat harder, but the place itself remained calm. He tied the rope around a cedar root, more out of discipline than fear, and lifted the slab fully aside. Underneath was a wooden hatch banded with iron, its surface dark but solid, protected from weather by the stone above. At the center was a small keyhole. Caleb removed the brass key from his pocket. It looked almost too delicate for the task, but when he slid it in, it fit without struggle. One turn. A click answered from below, clean and soft, like a sentence completed after many years. Ranger gave a low breath and backed up, giving Caleb room. The hatch opened upward on hidden hinges, revealing a set of narrow steps descending into darkness. Caleb shined his flashlight down. The beam found cedar walls, a handrail polished by use, and at the bottom, a closed door painted a faded blue. On that door, in white letters, someone had written, "No man comes home alone." Caleb stood at the threshold with the cold morning at his back and the hidden room waiting below. A veteran story was supposed to be about what a man endured, what he lost, what he carried when the parade ended and the uniform no longer told strangers how to treat him. But standing there, with Ranger beside him and an old promise breathing beneath the roots, Caleb wondered if the truest veteran stories were also about what other wounded hearts had quietly built for the ones who would come after. He descended one step, then another. The air grew warmer by a few degrees, dry and cedar sweet. Ranger followed close, his nails clicking softly on the wooden stairs. At the bottom, Caleb reached the blue door. The little brass key remained in his hand, though this door was not locked. It opened with the lightest push. The flashlight beam entered first, then widened across a room no larger than a one-car garage, yet arranged with the reverence of a chapel. Shelves lined the walls. Metal boxes sat labeled by year. A small radio rested on a desk beside a ledger, a lantern, and a folded American flag in a triangular case. There were photographs, dozens of them, pinned carefully along a corkboard, men in work coats, women in service caps, old trucks, repaired porches, smiling faces in front of barns, diners, and houses with fresh paint. Caleb stepped inside and felt the room receive him, not as an intruder, but as someone long expected. On the far wall, above a row of filing cabinets, Thomas Briggs had painted another line in steady white letters: "Worth is not measured by what a man owns, but by who finds shelter because he lived." Caleb lowered the flashlight. Ranger moved to the center of the room and sat quietly, his amber eyes shining in the dimness. In that buried cedar chamber beneath a forgotten $50 cabin, Caleb understood that he had not found a secret meant to make him rich. He had found a promise built carefully enough to survive until kindness came back to claim it. Caleb stood in the center of the buried cedar room with Ranger at his side and felt the strange quiet of a place that had kept its purpose alive longer than many people keep a promise. The air held the dry sweetness of cedar boards, old paper, brass, and dust warmed by earth. Nothing in the room seemed careless. Every shelf had been built by hand. Every label had been written in the same steady script. Every photograph had been pinned straight, as if Thomas Briggs had believed that even forgotten lives deserved order. Caleb moved slowly, his flashlight beam traveling across the walls, touching faces that looked back from different years of American life: a gray-haired man standing beside a repaired fishing boat in Oregon, a woman in a denim jacket holding keys to a small apartment in Ohio, two brothers smiling in front of a restored farmhouse in Kansas, an old veteran with a cane sitting on a diner stool while a German shepherd slept under his chair. Some wore uniforms in the photographs. Some did not. All of them had the same look in their eyes, the careful disbelief of people who had been helped after they had stopped expecting help. On the desk beneath the corkboard lay a leather ledger, dark brown, its edges softened by years of use. Caleb opened it with both hands. The first page carried Thomas Briggs's name, then a date nearly 40 years earlier, and a sentence written so firmly the ink had pressed into the paper: "A man who makes it home should not have to prove he deserves mercy." Caleb read that line twice. Then the names began. Page after page of them. Veterans, widows, mechanics, nurses, truck drivers, farmers, men who had slept in cars, women who had lost pensions to paperwork, families who needed a roof for one winter until pride could stand again. Beside each name, Thomas had written what was given, never in grand words. 2 months' rent. Stove repaired. Work boots. Bus ticket. Cabin stay, 12 days. Medical drive to Billings. Fence job arranged. No repayment asked. Sometimes, in the margin, Eleanor had added notes in her smaller hand. He likes black coffee. She sings when she is nervous. Send Christmas card. Dog trusted him immediately. Caleb's throat tightened in a way that felt almost embarrassing in the empty room. He had expected documents, perhaps some old money, maybe proof of land ownership hidden from taxmen and weather. He had not expected tenderness organized like a records office. Ranger rose and wandered toward the far shelf, sniffing a row of metal boxes marked Cedar Hollow Relief, 1989 to 1998, then 1999 to 2008, then 2009 to 2023. Caleb opened the most recent box. Inside were bank envelopes, notarized papers, land deeds, certificates of deposit, and letters from a law office in Helena. At first the language blurred under the flashlight, all legal descriptions, parcel numbers, trustee names, and county seals. Then the meaning began to form. Thomas and Eleanor had spent decades buying small pieces of ridge land around the cabin, 1 acre at a time when they could afford it, sometimes 3 acres when a neighbor passed and heirs wanted quick cash. Cedar groves. Creek access. An old service road. The abandoned ranger shed near the county line. Caleb laid the papers across the desk and followed the map references with his finger. What the town had dismissed as one broken cabin was connected to nearly 40 acres of quiet Montana ground, held inside a private trust whose purpose had been written in plain language: temporary shelter, work recovery, and peaceful reintegration for displaced American veterans and their service animals. He stepped back as if the words had given off heat. Ranger looked up at him, ears lifted. "This cannot be right," Caleb whispered, but the room did not answer with doubt. It answered with evidence. There were maintenance receipts, fuel accounts, building sketches, water test results, a letter from a retired contractor promising volunteer labor, and a yellow folder marked future cabins. Inside were drawings of 6 small log shelters arranged around a shared garden, each one modest, warm, and practical. A porch wide enough for 2 chairs. A ramp for bad knees. A wood stove. A dog run. A communal workshop where men and women could repair furniture, rebuild engines, mend fences, and remember the usefulness of their own hands. Caleb ran his thumb over one of the drawings and saw not architecture, but mercy made measurable in feet and inches. He had built bridges once, temporary structures meant to carry people across dangerous places. Thomas had tried to build a bridge too, only his was made of cedar, legal papers, saved dollars, and the stubborn faith that no life was too late to shelter. On the desk, beneath the ledger, Caleb found a sealed envelope with his full name written across it: Caleb Aaron Whitaker. His hand went still. No one had called him by his middle name since his mother died. For a long moment he could not open it. The room seemed to narrow around the envelope, and the snow-covered world above felt very far away. Ranger came to him and sat so close that his shoulder pressed against Caleb's knee. That was enough. Caleb opened the envelope. Inside was one page, signed by Eleanor Briggs only 2 months before her passing. "Mr. Whitaker," it read, "Thomas said the right caretaker would not come wearing a suit. He would come tired. He would come with a dog who listened before men spoke. He would come without asking what a thing was worth before deciding whether to protect it. I believe that man is you. The trust is legal. The land is paid for. There is money enough to begin, though not enough to waste. The county knows less than it should because Thomas wanted the wrong people uninterested. The lawyer has instructions, but the choice to continue the promise must be yours. If you accept, Cedar Hollow is not only your home. It is your first post in a different kind of service." Caleb lowered the page, and in the silence that followed, his old life seemed to stand on one side of the room while something new stood on the other. He thought of the pickup with its cracked windshield. The laundromat dryer vent. The church parking lot where he had pretended to check his tires so no one would know he had nowhere to go. He thought of other veterans he had met in passing, men with paper cups, women with duffel bags, people who joked too quickly because honesty would have cost too much. He had always believed his story had become small, reduced to survival, one meal, one shift, one cold night at a time. Yet here beneath the roots of a forgotten cabin, 2 old people he barely knew had placed a larger story in his hands. Not a rescue that ended with him. A rescue that began with him. Ranger suddenly turned toward the corkboard and touched his nose to a photograph near the bottom. Caleb lifted it carefully from its pin. The picture showed Thomas Briggs much older, standing on the porch of the cabin with Mercy at his feet. On the back, Eleanor had written, "When the right man arrives, the dog will know first." Caleb looked at Ranger. The German shepherd's amber eyes reflected the flashlight and something beyond it, something steady, ancient, and kind. Caleb folded Eleanor's letter and placed it inside his jacket close to his chest. Above him, the world still believed the cabin was worth almost nothing. Below, in the warm cedar dark, Caleb had found land, funds, records, and a mission that could change lives. But the most priceless thing in that room was not written on any deed. It was the first clear feeling Caleb had carried in years that he had not been left behind. He had been led here. Caleb carried the folders, the ledger, and Eleanor's final letter back up the cedar steps as if he were carrying something living. Ranger climbed ahead of him, pausing at the hatch to test the morning air before stepping into the snow. The world above seemed impossibly bright after the warm dark of the promise room. Sunlight had broken through the clouds and lay across Pine Hollow Ridge in long white bands, turning every branch, every drift, every quiet stone into something clean and newly made. Caleb closed the hatch, lowered the flat stone back into place, and brushed snow over its edges until Mercy's carved name rested in the open like a small blessing. He stood there for a moment with one hand on the cedar trunk, breathing hard though the climb had not been long. What waited below was more than he knew how to hold. A trust. Land. Plans. Records. A shelter meant for veterans who had run out of doors. It was the kind of gift that did not simply change a man's circumstances. It asked him to become large enough to carry its meaning. Ranger pressed his nose to Caleb's glove, then turned toward the cabin. The German shepherd did not hurry. He moved with a quiet confidence that made the path back feel less like a return and more like a beginning. Inside, Caleb spread the papers across the kitchen table, weighing the corners with a coffee mug, the compass, and a box of matches. The cabin looked different now. The cracked enamel pot, the cold stove, the old Bible, the rocking chair, the photograph above the mantel, all of it seemed less like remnants of a dead life and more like pieces of a mission waiting for hands. Caleb removed his jacket and worked for hours without noticing the time. He sorted the documents by year. He copied important numbers into a notebook. He found a list of contacts Eleanor had kept: Mr. Harlan Price, attorney; Ruth Bell, county clerk; Dennis Alvarez, retired contractor; June Whitcomb, church kitchen; Marcus Reed, veteran outreach, Great Falls. Next to Marcus Reed's name, Eleanor had written in pencil, honest man. Lost his brother. Will understand. Caleb touched that note with the tip of his finger. The dead, he thought, sometimes leave better introductions than the living. By noon, the cabin had warmed enough for the windows to sweat at the corners. Caleb ate standing up, a slice of bread with peanut butter from his duffel, while Ranger dozed near the hearth with one ear still angled toward him. It would have been easy to sit in that room and let the discovery remain beautiful because it was still private. Private miracles were safe. No one could laugh at them. No one could take them apart with forms, fees, doubts, or county procedures. But Thomas and Eleanor had not hidden the promise room so it could stay hidden forever. They had hidden it so the right hands could open it. Caleb took Eleanor's letter, folded it carefully, and drove back into Pine Hollow with Ranger in the passenger seat. The road looked different in daylight. The pines no longer seemed to crowd him. The fields beyond town rolled pale and gold under a winter sun. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin blue lines. A school bus passed, its yellow sides bright against the snow, and children inside leaned against the windows with the free curiosity of lives not yet taught to look away from strangers. Caleb parked in front of the law office just after 2 o'clock. Mr. Harlan Price was eating soup from a paper bowl at his desk when Caleb entered. The lawyer looked up, surprised, then stood so quickly that his spoon tipped into the bowl. "Mr. Whitaker," he said. "I did not expect you back so soon." Caleb placed the leather ledger, the trust papers, and Eleanor's letter on the desk. "Neither did I." Ranger sat beside the chair, calm but alert, his amber eyes watching the lawyer as if measuring the pace of his heartbeat. Mr. Price read in silence. At first, his expression was professional. Then it changed. The small muscles around his mouth softened. His glasses slid lower on his nose. He turned one page, then another, then removed his glasses entirely and rubbed his eyes with his thumb and forefinger. "I knew there was a trust," he said quietly. "I knew Mrs. Briggs had protected certain assets. But she only gave me instructions to release the full documents if you came back with the ledger and the second letter." He looked at Ranger. "She said the dog would find what the town had forgotten." Caleb almost smiled. "She said a lot without saying much." Mr. Price nodded, still looking at the papers. That was Eleanor. He opened a locked file drawer and removed a sealed packet bearing the Briggs family name. Inside were additional documents, county filings, a bank statement, and a letter from Thomas dated years earlier. The numbers were not extravagant in the way television liked to imagine hidden inheritances, but they were real, stable, and carefully grown, enough to repair the cabin, reopen the well, upgrade the road, build the first 2 small shelters, and keep the trust operating if managed with discipline. To Caleb, who had counted coins for coffee and slept under a wool blanket in a truck cab, the figures felt almost unreal. Yet what struck him was not the money. It was the intention behind every dollar. Nothing wasted. Nothing flashy. All of it pointed toward beds, heat, tools, and time for people who needed one more morning. There will be questions, Mr. Price said. The county will want inspections. Some folks will object to a veteran's shelter on ridge land. Not everyone understands something just because it is good. Caleb looked through the window toward Main Street. Across the road, a man scraped ice from a windshield. A woman carried groceries to an old sedan. Pine Hollow moved on, unaware that a hidden room beneath a cedar tree had just shifted the shape of its future. I am used to questions, Caleb said. And objections. The lawyer studied him. Do you accept the role of trust caretaker? For a moment, Caleb saw himself as the town had seen him yesterday, a homeless veteran in a worn jacket, a man with no fixed address, a man given a $50 cabin people called a joke. Then he saw Thomas's painted words on the buried room wall. He saw Eleanor in the rain asking why a man with nothing still gave. He saw Ranger at the cabin door, listening to a promise under the floor. Caleb placed his hand on the ledger. Yes, he said. The word was quiet, but it settled over the room with weight. Ranger leaned once against his leg, and Mr. Price nodded as if he had been waiting to hear that answer longer than he knew. Outside, the courthouse bell rang 3 times across the cold afternoon, clear and slow. Caleb did not mistake it for a sign, not exactly. He had lived too long to make every sound into heaven. But as the echoes moved down Main Street and faded into the snow-bright air, he felt something inside him answer all the same. Some calls do not arrive as thunder. Some arrive as paperwork, an old key, a loyal dog, and one tired man finally willing to believe he has been trusted with a light. By the end of that week, Pine Hollow had begun to talk. It started in the diner, as most truths and half-truths did, between the first coffee refill and the lunch rush, when a mechanic in a canvas coat told the waitress that the homeless veteran who slept in his truck had signed papers at Harlan Price's office. By noon, someone at the feed store said the old Briggs cabin was not as worthless as people thought. By Friday, a man at the barbershop claimed there was hidden money, government land, maybe even some forgotten war treasure under the ridge. Caleb heard pieces of it when he came into town for lumber, roofing tar, and well parts, but he did not answer any of it. He had learned that people often made a mystery smaller by trying to make it louder. The real thing was quieter. It lived in Thomas's ledger, Eleanor's handwriting, Ranger's steady gaze, and the old cedar room beneath the roots where every dollar had a purpose and every name had been remembered. He spent the mornings at the cabin, repairing what could be repaired before winter deepened. He patched the porch, sealed the kitchen window, cleared the chimney, and replaced 2 soft boards near the back wall. The work changed him by inches. His hands, once restless from too many nights with nothing useful to hold, found their old rhythm again. Measure twice. Cut clean. Set the nail true. He moved through the cabin like a man relearning a language he had spoken before sorrow interrupted him. Ranger stayed close, carrying small lengths of rope in his mouth, watching the tree line, sleeping near the promise room hatch whenever Caleb worked below. Sometimes Caleb caught himself speaking to Thomas as if the old veteran were in the next room. You should have used better flashing here, he would mutter at the roofline, or that shelf will hold another 20 pounds if I brace it right. The cabin answered in creaks, smoke, and warmth. On the 4th morning, Mr. Price drove up the ridge in a gray Subaru with salt along the doors and a folder of county papers on the passenger seat. Behind him came Dennis Alvarez, the retired contractor Eleanor had listed, a broad man in his late 60s with a white mustache, kind eyes, and knees that complained loudly each time he stepped from his truck. Dennis walked around the cabin once, looked at the chimney, the porch, the old cedar grove, and finally Caleb. "Eleanor told me I would know when the right man found it," he said. "She forgot to mention he would already be fixing my punch list." Caleb looked down, uncomfortable with praise. "Roof leaks do not wait for committees." Dennis laughed, a warm, gravelly sound that seemed to shake snow from the porch rail. Together, they inspected the land, the old service road, and the ranger shed near the county line. Dennis tapped beams with the handle of his hammer, made notes, and talked through practical things: insulation, septic permits, water pressure, foundation piers, county inspections, winter access. Mr. Price explained the trust requirements, the protected parcels, the spending limits, and the legal purpose Thomas and Eleanor had written with almost stubborn clarity. No luxury. No speculation. No sale to developers. Shelter first. Dignity always. Caleb listened carefully, asking fewer questions than most men would have, but better ones. Could a service animal stay in every cabin? Could the workshop be heated through February? Could one unit be built with wider doors for a wheelchair? Could the first shelter open before Christmas if volunteers came on weekends? Dennis studied him with growing respect. "You have thought about this." Caleb watched Ranger nose through snow near Mercy's Stone. "I have slept outside in November," he said simply. "That does a lot of the thinking for you." The first real test came 2 days later at the county meeting. It was held in a room behind the courthouse with folding chairs, bad coffee, fluorescent lights, and a map of Pine Hollow County taped to a corkboard. Caleb wore his cleanest shirt under the field jacket. Ranger lay at his feet, calm and silent, his harness brushed, his ears turning at every cough and chair scrape. Mr. Price presented the trust. Dennis explained the repairs. A woman from the church offered meals during construction. Then the questions came, not cruel at first, only nervous. Who would stay there? How long? Who would supervise? Would it bring problems to the ridge? Would property values change? Caleb sat through it all, hands folded, eyes lowered, until an older rancher near the back said, "I respect service as much as any man, but good intentions do not run a place like that. No offense, Mr. Whitaker, but you do not even have a home yourself." The room went still. Caleb felt Ranger lift his head. For one brief second, shame reached for him out of old habit. It knew the way. It had lived in his pockets, his truck, his silence. But this time it found the door closed. Caleb stood slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not dress his pain in anger. He only looked at the faces in the room, the people who had seen him in parking lots, under awnings, at the diner counter counting coins, and he let them see him clearly. "That is exactly why I know what this place needs," he said. Not pity. Not speeches. A bed. A lock on the door. Coffee in the morning. Work for the hands. Quiet for the mind. A place where a man or woman can bring a dog and not be told the only loyal thing left in their life has to stay outside. Ranger rose then, not dramatically, not on command, but because he sensed the room shift. Caleb rested one hand on the German shepherd's head. Thomas and Eleanor Briggs built this trust for people who served and then fell through the spaces everyone else steps over. I am not asking Pine Hollow to carry it. I am asking Pine Hollow not to stand in the way of the promise they already paid for. No one spoke for several seconds. Then June Whitcomb from Grace Methodist, a small woman with silver hair and a blue cardigan, stood with tears shining but not falling. Eleanor brought soup to my husband every Wednesday after he came back from the hospital, she said. She never told anybody. If this is what she wanted, then I will cook the first pot. Dennis stood next. I will bring the crew. The hardware store owner cleared his throat. I can discount materials. One by one, not everyone, but enough, the room softened. Not because doubt disappeared, but because kindness had become harder to dismiss when spoken plainly by a man who had needed it. The vote was not final approval for everything. Life rarely opens all gates at once. But it granted repairs, waterwork, road access, and the first 2 shelter units under the trust's purpose. For Caleb, it was enough to begin. That evening, he drove back to Cedar Hollow beneath a sky washed clean by sunset. Ranger sat beside him, eyes half closed, the way he did when the day's work had honored something true. At the cabin, Caleb lit the fire and placed the county approval papers beside Thomas's ledger. The flames moved over both old promise and new permission, glowing in the same amber light. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and unhurried. Caleb stood at the window and looked toward the hidden hatch beneath Mercy's cedar tree. The world had called the cabin worthless because it did not know how to measure shelter before it became visible. But now the first boards were being cut, the first names would soon be written, and the first light in that forgotten ridge would not be for Caleb alone. For the first time in years, tomorrow did not feel like another night to survive. It felt like lumber waiting to become a doorway. Spring did not arrive at Cedar Hollow all at once. It came in small mercies, a drip from the porch roof at noon, a patch of brown earth showing through snow near the woodpile, the first clean smell of thaw moving up from the creek, Ranger lying in a square of sunlight as if he had been appointed guardian of warmth itself. For weeks, Caleb worked beside men and women who had once only nodded at him from a distance. Dennis Alvarez brought 2 retired carpenters and a trailer full of tools. June Whitcomb arrived every Saturday with soup, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to hold a spoon upright. The hardware store sent lumber at cost. The church youth group painted railings. A rancher who had doubted the project at the county meeting came quietly one afternoon with gravel for the road and never mentioned what he had said before. Caleb accepted the help without making anyone kneel under the weight of apology. He had learned something from Eleanor, that forgiveness did not always need a speech. Sometimes it looked like taking the other end of a board and lifting together. By late April, the old cabin no longer sagged toward the earth. Its cedar walls had been cleaned and sealed. The roof held firm under spring rain. The well pump worked with a steady hum. 2 small shelter cabins stood beyond the main clearing, modest and beautiful in the plain American way: front porches, warm windows, wood stoves, hooks for coats, shelves for boots, and dog beds built into the corner of each room. Caleb made sure of that himself. No veteran who arrived with a service animal or a loyal old dog would be asked to choose between shelter and the creature that had kept them alive through the lonely parts. At the entrance to the Ridge Road, Dennis helped him set a sign made from a single slab of cedar. Caleb had sanded the surface by hand until the grain rose like water. In careful black letters, it read, "Briggs Promise Cabin." Underneath, smaller but deep enough to last through weather, "For veterans who need one more morning." When they stood back to look at it, June pressed a hand to her mouth. Mr. Price removed his glasses and pretended to clean them longer than necessary. Ranger walked to the post, sniffed the fresh wood, and sat beneath it with solemn approval. Caleb did not say much. Words felt too small beside the sign, the cabins, the ridge, and the invisible hands of Thomas and Eleanor moving through all of it. The first guest arrived on a rainy evening in May. His name was Samuel Boone, 68 years old, a Navy veteran with a gray beard, a careful limp, and a small brown mutt named Daisy tucked inside his jacket like a secret he was afraid the world might take. Marcus Reed from Veteran Outreach in Great Falls drove him up the ridge in an old white van. Caleb saw the headlights through the rain and stepped onto the porch before they honked. Ranger came to his side, ears forward, tail low and gentle. Samuel stepped out slowly, looking at the main cabin, the 2 shelter cabins, the stacked firewood, the lit windows, the coffee steaming behind the glass. His eyes moved over everything with suspicion first, then confusion, then a hope so fragile Caleb almost looked away to protect it. "They said I could stay a few nights," Samuel said. His voice was rough but polite. "Just until I figure things out." Caleb walked down the steps and held out his hand. "You can stay as long as the program allows, and long enough to breathe." Samuel looked at the offered hand, then at Ranger. Daisy poked her nose from his jacket and gave one small sneeze. Ranger lowered himself to the wet ground, making his large body smaller, and waited. Daisy sniffed the air, then wagged once. That was all it took. Samuel's shoulders dropped by half an inch, but Caleb saw it. Some burdens do not leave a man dramatically. They loosen one breath at a time. June had left stew on the stove. The fire was already going in the first shelter cabin. Caleb walked Samuel through the room, showing him the bed, the lamp, the clean towels, the coffee tin, the hooks by the door, the small dog bed with a folded blanket. Samuel stood very still when he saw that last detail. He reached down and touched the blanket with 2 fingers. "You made a place for her too," he said. Caleb nodded. "Would not be much of a welcome if we left out family." The older man turned toward the window, and for a moment the rain on the glass blurred his reflection. He did not cry, not exactly. But he removed his cap and held it against his chest as if entering a chapel. That night, after Samuel and Daisy had settled in, Caleb returned to the main cabin and opened Thomas's ledger to a fresh page. He wrote the date, Samuel's name, Daisy's name, and the words, "First guest. Arrived in rain. Dog trusted Ranger." Then he stopped, because his hand was shaking. Ranger rested his chin on Caleb's knee, steady as always. Caleb looked around the room that had once smelled of dust and waiting. Now it held coffee, cedar smoke, clean dishes, work gloves, maps, letters, and the quiet music of rain on a roof that no longer leaked. Above the mantel, the photograph of Thomas, Eleanor, and Mercy watched over the fire. Caleb lifted his eyes to them. "We started," he said softly. Outside, the rain faded near midnight. Clouds opened, and moonlight spread across the clearing, silvering the cabins, the sign, the wet pines, and the path to Mercy's cedar tree. Caleb stepped onto the porch with Ranger beside him. From the first shelter cabin came the faint warm glow of a lamp. One light. One bed filled. One veteran not sleeping in a truck, under an awning, or beside a road. It was not the whole answer to all the pain in the world. It was not meant to be. Grace often begins smaller than people expect. A cup of coffee. A dry blanket. A dog allowed inside. A door unlocked at the right hour. Caleb breathed in the clean night air and felt, for the first time in years, that the silence around him was not empty. It was peaceful. He had not been given riches in the way rumors wanted to tell it. He had been given something far more difficult and far more sacred, a reason to keep the light on. Ranger leaned against his leg, warm and certain beneath the stars. Down by the cedar sign, rainwater slipped from the carved letters and fell quietly into the earth, as if the ridge itself were learning the words by heart. Caleb looked toward the glowing window of the first shelter cabin and understood what Eleanor had known from the beginning. Kindness always returns, but it rarely comes back as applause. Sometimes it comes back as work, as trust, as a small room warmed before a stranger arrives. Sometimes a man is not rescued from his life so he can escape the world. Sometimes he is rescued so others can find the road through him. And on that quiet Montana night, with a faithful German shepherd at his side and one more morning waiting behind every lit window, Caleb Whitaker finally knew he was home.